Well, thank you so much, and thank you for accommodating me. I'm very sorry for not being able to make it in person. Sorry mainly for myself, but this is it. Teaching is more important than research. All right, I'm a philosopher of science, and what I will try to do today is basically offer reconstructions of the use of informational models, which are a type of mathematical models, that is compatible with the mechanistic project in biology. And the reconstruction is based on historical precedents from the history of biology. All right, so I'll jump right in. So let's say that there are at least two projects in consciousness research. So one could see it as a traditional project would be a continuation of the mechanistic project in biology. Probably this is best approximated by Anil Seth's framing of the real problem of consciousness, which is that of explaining, predicting, and above all, controlling the phenomenological properties of conscious experience. And how this is achieved? Well, in biology, this is usually done by elucidating the mechanisms causing or underlying or underpinning phenomenon of interest. Once one knows what are the mechanisms responsible for a phenomenon, then it becomes possible to predict and above all control and manipulate the phenomenon in question. The other project which is issued from this informational, so this new, much more novel approaches, which are informational approaches in the research on consciousness, and at least under some formulations, and I have here in mind the integrated information theory of consciousness. Some researchers see these informational models as requiring a more or less radical revision of physical theory. So at the core of this new project is a new model, or if you want, a recharacterization of the phenomenon of consciousness, which is described in terms of structural features of consciousness, which in turn are accounted in terms of various indexes of complexity and informational relationships. And this has been sometimes paired with a non-mechanistic physical interpretation. For example, it has been claimed that consciousness is an ubiquitous fundamental causal capacity of nature, in some respects to the fundamental quantities in physics, such as mass. Now, what I will propose is a reconstruction which highlights points of continuity between the two projects, but remain roughly within the general scope of a mechanistic project. And as I said, this is based on historical precedents which document the role of mathematical models of phenomena in guiding mechanistic research. All right, so a quick introduction to the new mechanistic philosophy in biology. What is the goal of a mechanistic explanation? There are several definitions. I'll give you the one that I prefer, which would be to detail how a phenomenon is produced as a result of changes and interaction among the parts of physical systems. And this physical system are usually circumscribed within the spatio-temporal boundary of an experimental model of the phenomenon. So here's an example, exposure. So how we characterize a phenomenon in biology? Well, one typical way of doing it is in terms of stimulus and response. You subject a biological system to a stimulus and you observe the response. So here's the phenomenon of inflammation, which is actually a family of phenomena. But to simplify it, it's just a phenomenon. You expose human organisms to hormone stimulation, and this typically triggers a response consisting of 5 symptoms. Okay, so a quick note on the phenomenon, how the phenomenon is characterized. There are 2 elements of it. There is a mathematical description, might be implicit or explicit, and in this case is a reproducible correlation between exposure and outcome. So this is the characterization of the phenomenon to be explained. Trying to explain is why, or rather how, the response is produced after the stimulation. And paired to this mathematical description or characterization of the phenomenon, there is also a physical system is specified. So this would be the mental setups in which the human organism is exposed to stimuli. So this is the experimental model of the phenomenon. So I have the characterization of the phenomenon, the model of the phenomenon, and the experimental model of the phenomenon, which is basically the experimental setup in the context of which the phenomenon can be replicated, reproduced. So this has been applied to consciousness as well. There are various attempts to characterize the phenomenon of consciousness, and as well as an experimental model of this phenomenon. And perhaps the most common characterization is in terms of psychophysical measures of stimulus and responses. Okay. Of experimental models, there are several. And the idea is to contrast a situation in which consciousness or conscious awareness or subjective experience is present versus a situation in which it is not. So I'll not go through the whole list, but there are well-defined experimental paradigms for studying this. Okay, now I can make a jump, a transition to the informational models. What the informational models propose in a first step is the qualitative recharacterization of the phenomenon of consciousness in terms of structural properties of conscious phenomenology. And an example of this would be the axiom of the IIT, for example. But of course, different authors propose different properties, and there are several lists available in the literature. Again, from my philosophical standpoint, the exact list is not that important. I'm not more interested in basically how the whole project is articulated, so to speak, the architecture, the skeleton of the project. So what I observe, I mean, what I noticed as a philosopher, that this qualitative recharacterization concerns solely the model of the phenomenon as such, and nothing is said about the experimental model of the phenomenon. So one may guess that perhaps one would use the same experimental model, or perhaps an entirely experimental model is required. One thing that I can note immediately is basically that the structural properties are identified by introspection, which mean that for all intents and purposes, they describe the one and only form of consciousness that we can possibly introspect, which is human consciousness. So perhaps there is an experimental model that's implied after all. Okay, now, what's this qualitative recharacterization? Well, I'll say that despite the diversity of structural properties that have been proposed, there is a core consensus that consciousness is supposed to be integrated and informative or differentiated. And this would be the two core structural features. And the claim is that these structural features can be captured or can be completely described by an informational measure or an index of complexity, reflecting the amount of information a system generates as a whole over and above the amount of information generated by its parts independently. So what's the implication here? Well, the implication, the obvious implication is that the input-output information, or if you want by extension, the stimulus-response characterizations, which are typical of psychophysics, cannot capture all the structural properties of consciousness, and a new description coming with a new mathematical formalism is ultimately needed to quantitatively describe the phenomenon of consciousness. So this would be a first contribution, which is very important, that of recharacterizing the phenomenon. Okay. Now, there are a couple of assumptions underlying this new recharacterization. So the assumption is that the list of structural properties is complete. So this gives us a complete description of the phenomenon of consciousness. Tononi and Koch describe this by claiming that the axioms of the IT are essential, they apply to all experiences, then they're complete. They include all the essential properties shared by every experience. If you want a methodological parallel to this claim, that would be the equivalent of claiming that the qualitative model of the phenomenon, which is described by the axiom of IIT, for example, satisfy the desiderata of constant and content validity. Okay, so we have a complete description of the phenomenon which captures all the relevant aspects of the phenomenon. Nothing is left on the side. So of course, by implication, any informational measure or any index of complexity that can account for all the structural properties of consciousness. So for example, the quantity phi, likewise satisfy this desiderata of construct and content validity. Now, of course, none of this is proven, but ideally this is something that's important from an experimental point of view, determining that indeed the description is complete. As a side note, the completeness assumption is necessary but not sufficient to justify the claim that consciousness is identical, for example, integrated information. The additional requirement would be to claim that the axiom of IT, for example, are also exclusive. They provide an exclusive description of the phenomenon of consciousness and no other phenomenon. And that's, of course, is something that's rather difficult to prove. Now, in terms of the quantitative models, so which measure in the end is in which informational measure best capture all the structural properties of consciousness. Well, there are many proposals on the market. So I listed a couple. This is not an exhaustive list. They vary in the way that the complexity, for example, is measured. And what I highlight here in particular is how exactly these indexes of complexity are calculated. What do they require from an experimental point of view? Is it possible to calculate it based on observational data alone? Do they require interventions? And if they require interventions, can we rely on the traditional kind of interventions, the stimulus response kind of interventions that are conducted in biology and are usually used to elucidate mechanisms, or do they require something more? So for example, phi requires something more, requires all possible interventional data. So how a system reacts to all possible intervention. And this, of course, places additional demands on experimental research. Okay, now, one thing that's been mentioned, I suppose, mostly in the philosophical literature, is this informational relationships and indexes of complexity don't have a built-in physical interpretation. So these relationships are defined in strictly mathematical terms, so they're mathematical constructs. They don't make any explicit reference to physical entities or processes in virtue of which information, for example, is transmitted from one entity or to another, or one part system to another system. So overall, there's no physical interpretation that is assumed or implied. One could work with purely mathematical construct and it makes no difference whatsoever to the calculations. So for example, a system, as is described in the IIT, is nothing else but a mathematical object, which is usually an abstract graph, a causal graph, for example. But this is a mathematical entity. So complexity or integrated information can be defined and calculated in exactly the same way for any graph whose edges are oriented. The orientation of the edges, for example, doesn't come with a built-in interpretation. We could interpret them in many ways. We can interpret them, of course, in terms of causal dependence, but in philosophy, for example, some philosophers interpreted them in terms of supervenience. Supervenience, this kind of instantaneous causation, if you will, as well as in terms of nomic relationships. And other kinds of metaphysical interpretations. So this physical interpretation or metaphysical interpretation in some cases is irrelevant to the calculation. Nothing really changes from a mathematical point of view. Now, what would be the implications? Well, the implication, I mean, the obvious one is that these informational metrics don't come with a built-in physical interpretation, which in turn means that the informational models only specify the kind of mathematics which are needed to describe the structural properties of consciousness. This is an idea about how we could talk in a mathematically meaningful way about a phenomenon that interests us. In principle, the formal characterization offered by informational models is compatible with multiple interpretation of informational relationships and their relata. And this means that the informational model, the model of the phenomenon as such, doesn't really tell us what consciousness is from a physical or metaphysical point of view. Okay, so unless a physical interpretation is attached, then there are no implications about the ultimate nature of consciousness. Now, the fact that consciousness can be described and measured by a complexity index doesn't rule out the possibility that this index may also describe and measure phenomena other than consciousness. And of course, all these indexes, they come from somewhere. These are mathematical measures being developed usually to measure other phenomena in physics, such as the transfer of energy, or in computer science to measure the transfer of information across networks, for example. And it has been argued that the extent to which differential dynamics networks, so measures such as phi could also measure the extent to which differential dynamics networks achieve efficiency in their global information or energy transfer. Okay. So this is true even if completeness or construct validity is demonstrated, even if it's demonstrated that phi actually does offer a complete description of the phenomenon of consciousness. It doesn't entail that this description is unique to consciousness. So it's a question of entailment, in which way it goes. So completeness ensures that if I know that I'm talking about consciousness, that I know that this implies the completeness. The model implies that an informational metric tells me everything I need to know about consciousness. But if I'm giving an informational metric, this doesn't entail automatically that I'm talking about consciousness. I could be talking about some other phenomenon as well. Okay. So this was the phenomenon, the model of the phenomenon, the mathematical characterization of the phenomenon. How do we go from this mathematical characterization of the phenomenon to the substrate or mechanism responsible for that phenomenon? Well, there are many historical precedents in biology where a mathematical model of the phenomenon proved to be a very useful tool for specifying physical systems that can realize or implement, if you want, the mathematical relationships postulated in the model. So there have been a couple of examples that have been investigated in some depth in the literature. One of them is Mendel's probabilistic model of inheritance, which accurately describes and predicts certain patterns of inheritance. And this model, which is just a probabilistic model, it's a mathematical model, also provided the first insight into the biological mechanisms of inheritance when two cytologists, Sutton and Bovary, realized that the behavior of chromosome matches the combinatorial behavior of what Mendel called elements. Okay, so this provided the first step from moving from a description of the phenomenon to have the first indications about what the mechanism responsible for the phenomenon might be. The other example that's been discussed in literature is the Hodgkin-Huxley model of the action potential. And this has been described here, I'm quoting directly, remains one of the best examples of how phenomenological description with mathematical modeling can reveal mechanism long before they can be directly absorbed. So what the model predicted, well, it predicted the charged particles. It was already known that these are ions cross the cellular membrane of neurons, the axons of neurons, which in turn suggested the existence of transmembrane ion channels having certain characteristics, and the model famously predicted that there must be both voltage gated and leak channels. So again, the mathematical model provided the first indication about how certain phenomena are implemented in terms of cellular and molecular mechanisms. So just what these two models in particular have in common, well, both are mathematical models of the phenomenon of interest. Both are compatible with multiple physical interpretations. This is particularly obvious in the case of the HH model, which can also be applied, for example, to electrical circuits, and is nowadays applied as well in the construction, or rather the programming of artificial neurons. And both rely on a principle of structural homomorphism, specifying physical systems that can realize the mathematical relationships postulated by the model. So this is a principle of structural realism. in which the mathematical model of the phenomenon, the structure of it reflects or is partially isomorphic with the structure of physical physical systems. Now, in the case, for example, of the IIT, which I think is the best articulated information model, homomorphism is captured by the postulates of the theory, which Tononi describes as the properties of experience that are derived from axiom of integrated information theory, and that must be satisfied by this physical substrate of consciousness. So in the case of IIT, the homomorphism follows logically from the fact that causal structure determines informational relationship, and informational relationships are predicted relationships. There is the huge literature on causal theory, and basically the idea is that causal relationships determine, for example, patterns of association and dissociation. Now, if we assume that informational relationships are underpinned by causal dependencies among the parts of a system, informational models are a very useful tool for determining what kind of causal structures and what kind of dynamics are compatible with the requirements postulated by informational models of consciousness. And of course, this can advance the mechanistic research program, as well as lead to the identification and validation of biological neurosignatures of consciousness, which of course are a very useful tool in clinical practice. Okay, so now what exactly the various mathematical informational models predicts in respect to the substrate of consciousness? Can make a couple of very general observations that one can divide roughly these models into categories. For example, in the case of neural complexity, causal density models proposed by Stats, for example, and the PCI, which I forgot what it stands for. Well, anyway, it's the ZAP and ZIP methodology. Well, all these metrics, I mean, in complexity indexes can be calculated from observed dynamics of the unperturbed systems over time. So this is strictly observational data, which is data that is readily available, or the observed responses to a restricted range of perturbation, which is the conventional interventional data that's usually acquired in experimental science. So what the implication here is that the data required for the calculation could be, at least in principle, obtained from existing experimental models of the phenomenon of consciousness. And this kind of provides a nice way of bridging the gap between the mechanistic project, which has this is in the experimental tradition, and the informational approaches, which bring all these new mathematical tools. Now, the IIT, it's a bit more complex because it seems to measure the capacity of a system to generate a complex dynamics, and it could be in principle measured by measuring the responses of a system under all possible perturbations. And the implication, at least the philosophical implication, is that the physical realizer implementing something like are not, strictly speaking, mechanisms. Why? Well, this is kind of a philosophical limitation. Mechanisms have been defined or construed as active processes and not as static structures or capacity or dispositions. Now, I think that probably there's...
To the end in a minute or two or so.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Great.
So one can still work around it. Perhaps one can work something along a frequentist interpretation, like in probabilities, where causal capacity could be construed as mechanistic behaviors observed over a sufficiently long time and a sufficiently wide range of perturbation. Or perhaps they could be likened to certain biological mechanisms, for example, those generating potential for variability. So they're a couple of interesting parallels that could be drawn. Okay, So that is it. Now what I'm giving you here is my reconstruction of the physical interpretation offered by Tononi and Koch in their 2015 article. What you see on the left side is the mechanistic project with the recharacterization of the phenomenon of consciousness, which replaces this standard stimulus response or extrinsic information approach with measures of complexity or intrinsic information. And this would supposed to give us some new clues about the physical substrate of consciousness. For example, tells us that this kind of some kind of a causal capacity mechanism that generates many combinatorial possibilities. Now the IAT itself goes into a completely different direction. It proposes that this recharacterization of the phenomenon is not only complete, but it's also exclusive, such that one can conclude that consciousness is the same thing that's integrated information, or consciousness is the same thing as phi. And this leads to the panpsychism conclusion. I don't have any objections per se. All I can tell you is that there are no precedents of such an approach, at least in biology. Why? Because it's going to be rather difficult to prove that this characterization is exclusive to consciousness, such that whenever you have this kind of mathematical model where it can only describe consciousness and only consciousness, there's nothing else that can be described. And then the claim that consciousness is a causal capacity, then again, it's another kind of leap, because it kind of muddles the difference between the model of the phenomenon itself and its explanation. The phenomenon is supposed to be the explanandum, the thing that needs the explaining, and the physical substrate, so the mechanism, is supposed to be the explanans, the thing that does the explaining. If you meld them together by claiming that consciousness is a causal capacity, then things get rather complicated, at least from a philosophical point of view, and this sends back to a couple of paradoxes that have been highlighted in the literature, in the philosophical literature on philosophy of mind. But since I don't have time to get there, I'll just stop right here. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.